On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego.
This will be Peter Krapp from UC Irvine, once again the disembodied voice of Manuel de Landa as well. And in many ways, this is a panel on cosmography and the cosmogram, the image of the world, and the way in which we, as a species, subspecies, protospecies, attempt to conceptualize the entirety of the world, the entirety of the universe, as a single diagrammatic thought, a pictorial comprehension and representation of the entirety of existence. One which is drawn on various and varying diagrammatic techniques, from the simple vertical elevation of heaven, hell, and Hades, to the more mathematic plane of concentric spheres used to visualize both geocentric and later heliocentric astronomies. We recall that for more than 1,000 years, Aristotelian and Ptolemaic cosmophysics posited a kind of double-layer astronomic architecture, a kind of stack, perhaps not so unlike the OSI or TCP/IP stack later. The core was comprised of the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and around this the moon circled and formed a border between the two layers. Beyond the moon, there was another physics, it was thought, at work, another type of material known as quintessence. On Earth, motion was understood to be linear and drew all things downward toward the core, but motion above was a rotational arc, an orbit held in place by invisible crystalline spheres that guided and delimited the tracking career of these celestial arcs. And this kind of the cosmography, the thinking of the totality at once, is, as I suggested, qua Frederick Jameson. Utopian thinking is also a way of thinking the totality at once, and requires a thinking of the totality. But I think as we've traced through this symposium in ways that both sort of a kind of positive image and negative image, one turning into the other, that the status of the utopian and the status of that totality has shifted in ways in which we're perhaps not always capable of keeping a handle on. The cybernetics of scenario planning, it seems, has given way to something else, something like the eschatology of apophenia. And perhaps geopolitics itself has become something of a dark side of the rainbow effect. Some of you know what I mean by that. If you don't, ask your neighbor. They can perhaps explain. Dark side of the rainbow is. And with this shift, information becomes, in a way, unmanageable, nonlinear, associative, arbitrary. Anything is enrolled into the local rhetoric of conspiracy, for meta-addressability, for atemporality, for speculative realist science fiction, for various forms of neo-Lysenkoism. And this is a challenge to philosophy, to the possibility of thinking. Geophilosophy, we say, itself is a kind of challenge to the scale at which design can define its work in the world, both spatial orders of magnitude, from the nanometric to the astronomic, and temporal scale, from microseconds to the microseconds of neuroscience to the millennia of geologic and ecological structure. Any jurisdiction, any site condition is constituent, as we know and we've seen in, I think, Ricardo's presentation made very clear, constituent of multiple enveloping habitats, which makes any local global distinction utterly relational. One pole always envelopes in and is enveloped by the other. So after Jean-Luc Nancy, we could say that the geophilosophical is perhaps directly and importantly distinct from really existing globalization, that supercomputing does not inoculate us from feudalism, from superstition, but it can, perhaps, and this is the bet. We're talking about optimism and pessimism. This is a kind of a bet. Perhaps provide for its opposite, a kind of futurism without guarantees, only plasticity. So if we have come up to then that point sort of on the edge where the diagram begins to unhold itself, break apart in different ways. I've asked Peter Krapp to push us completely off the edge with his presentation, and I think he'll succeed admirably. Peter, I've known for many years. We actually went to graduate school together, shared many seminars that were of seminal importance to my own intellectual genealogy, and someone who I'm very happy to have here and to be part of this discourse, not only for that reason, but also because I'm a fan and admirer of his work. He's been someone who has threaded together a particular generation of what we call media philosophy, Friedrich Hitler and Jacques Lacan, into the moment in which the digital has risen not to a kind of mechanism of the device, but to really as an infrastructure of our economies, of our ways of thinking, of our ways of organizing culture, and has provided maps of those translations in ways that I think will be durable and useful for much time to come. He's an associate professor of film and media studies, visual studies, and English at UC Irvine, affiliated also with the Department of Informatics. He's the author of Deja Vu, Aberrations of Cultural Memory, 2004, and most recently, Noisy Channels, Glitch and Error in Digital Culture. So off we go. Peter Krapp, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Happy that some of you are still here. And I think I can speak for most of us if I thank and congratulate Ben Bratton and Tara Zeppel and Larry Smar and everybody else who was involved in making this possible at Cal IT2 for a really exhausting 2 days. I will speak into the microphone. Keep reminding me. So no, that was feigned exhaustion. You know, it's good. I didn't move, but I still feel, you know, I exercised my mind. Nonetheless, I think, you know, I'm not going to do anything from my book that's forthcoming because I was asked to do something a little crazier than that, to reboot, you know, how we think about geopolitics. And since I'm in the uncomfortable position of being the last living speaker, or live speaker, excuse me, or afterwards we'll hear some canned voice, we can all relax in the dark. I'm going to have to rib Ben a little bit when he calls the Center for Design and Geopolitics a think tank. Because if this is going to be about geophilosophy, it should be rebooting how we think about these kinds of questions. And hopefully, when I will focus on looking back at some really crazy ways to think about Earth, I'm not going to offend those who insist that we must be peering into the near and far future of the planet. Why think tank? What is a think tank? When Naomi Klein states that by think tanks, I mean the people who are paid to think by the makers of tanks, we're given to understand that a think tank epitomizes the military-industrial complex. But when Ben Bratton describes DDP as a think tank, I bet that's not what he had in mind. Nonetheless, until 1970, the approximately 24 think tanks in the United States followed the model of the country's first think tank, the Brookings Institution, founded in 1916. The mission was to provide objective, rigorous policy analysis on a wide array of issues. Of course, there are other institutions in France, Canada, and elsewhere that could be mentioned, but let's stay closer to home for now. Beginning in the 1970s, think tanks became increasingly ideological and focused on specific policy goals. For instance, since 1970, the Heritage Foundation's mission has explicitly stated that it focuses on formulating and promoting conservative public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense, end quote. Many of the legislative initiatives and economic policies of the Reagan Revolution were hatched by conservative think tanks in the 70s and 80s. And then there's now a phase where perhaps think tanks are expanding even more in number, and the question is how they relate to that heritage. Many of us might still associate the phrase think tank mostly with RAND, the Air Force-funded outfit for research and development. And by the way, the drones or UAVs that Jordan Crandall talked about and joyfully crashed were first conceptualized by RAND in the early 70s. And to sweeten the bitterness of that idea, RAND advocates called their proposed pilotless aircraft RPVs, remotely piloted vehicles. So during the past 20 years, there's been a virtual think tank boom. Today, there are about 3,500 think tanks in the United States. Donors and foundations granted about $1 billion in the 90s to support think tanks in their work of knowledge production. But if that's what we're doing here, if we are in your tank, Ben, what kind of thought is encouraged here? I think in general, whether you look at the 70s or the most recent formations of think tanks, they all operate in a certain mode of duration. This is my excuse for taking longer than my 20 minutes, by the way. They operate in a mode of delay. You're going to take some time. Unlike a war room, a think tank is not meant to generate instant decisions in the mode of a constant crisis, but to accompany and support a longer decision-making process and estimate implications of a possible decision. So think tanks can be depicted as a form of intellectual playground, as a probability space for the production of different alternative scenarios. And in this iterated time delay, a thinking of the unthinkable, as Herman Kahn popularized the phrase, not only is feasible, but mandatory. And computer simulations and techniques of scenario building that we've already seen in evidence here in the conference are the proven and paradigmatic tools for these think tank processes. Accordingly, think tanks also contributed substantially to the development of these media of thought. Whether they emphasize policy advising or business and strategy consulting, they operate within a conflict between freedoms and restraints, a mix of seriousness and informality as the proving grounds for interdisciplinary efforts. And we were just chatting before the panel that it's of course true that we wouldn't have computer simulation in general and climate modeling in particular without the major effort by national labs and think tanks that brought the world the nuclear bomb. But it's also true that our search for planetary modes of thought cannot be limited to techno-scientific instrumental rationality. So I would like to emphasize at least the possibility of a space for thought and for unconventional forms of thinking that takes greater risks, obviously, but I submit to you that we're already deep in the hole. And further, that in fact there's a proud tradition of falling into deep holes. Because the very tradition of theoretical thought, the history of philosophy, is said to begin with a fall into a well. By Thales of Miletus in ancient Greece, who was not watching his step while making conjectures about the stars up above. Of course, some people are quick to point out that the history of theory also that means began with the laughter of the peasant who saw him fall in. But Thales' rejection of mythological explanation became an essential idea for the scientific revolution. He was also the first to define general principles and set forth hypotheses. Albert Einstein famously improved on that experimental test setup by observing someone else taking a fall off a roof in Berlin. Just like Thales, if the Berlin roofer had not survived, our intellectual history would be much poorer, since he shared with the curious bystander Einstein the fact that during the free fall, he felt no gravity. There's nothing accidental in these two complementary anecdotes about theoretical modes of inquiry. At the outset, the theorist needs to suffer to persuade others of his empirical attitude. Yet at the other end, the genius doesn't have to take the fall himself, not only because of the risk to his life and limb, but because it's so much better if an ordinary person on the street can furnish objectivity for a theory of relativity. While I have you looking deep into holes, I want to remind you that the storytelling power, the power of imagination, is just as fertilizing for all sorts of problem solving, including the hardest of hard sciences, as anything else. And in fact, the story of Alice, of course, combines in the first few pages both falling deeply into a well and the idea of falling off a roof. I don't know if you can decipher this, but most people will remember how the story goes, so I won't read you the pages out loud. Not only is she falling into a well and manages to grab a glass of orange marmalade, she is also then speculating about what this means. Top of the second page there. After such a fall as this, I shall think nothing of tumbling downstairs. How brave they'll all think me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it even if I fell off the top of the house. And as many readers of Alice in Wonderland point out, this is not the first death joke in the book. Falling into a really deep hole then very quickly became a thought experiment. And people took this story very, very seriously in various modes. Also to poke serious fun of big science, and in particular the kind of physical speculation that this gave rise to immediately. This is from the early 20th century the magazine The Strand, where Camille Flammarion, who is an amateur astronomer, proposed punching a hole through the Earth. Flammarion, on his age, you could name H.G. Wells and Jules Verne as science fiction authors of that era, but also the Italian futurists, were happy to mix scientific enthusiasm with ridicule when addressing the hubris that becomes before a deep, deep fall all the way through the planet. They wanted to dig a hole that would connect the two poles. And people started calculating that your initial acceleration would, of course, only be the surface acceleration of gravity, but it would diminish as you approach the center. Your weight, assuming, of course, there's no air resistance or nothing else inside of the planet, your weight would be zero as you fly through the center of the Earth if it is of uniform density and there's no air friction or temperature differences. It would take about 42 minutes to arrive at the other side. Alice, if falling all the way through, as she wonders whether she might be, would accelerate to as much as 17,700 miles an hour and pop up on the other side. Unless she grabs something to hold on, she would fall back again and continue to oscillate with a round-trip time of 84.5 minutes. I don't have that much time here today, so I'm just trying to get you a little closer to the core. Ideas that the Earth is hollow abound, especially in the 19th century, not just in science fiction, but in very serious proposals for expeditions, such as the one proposed by John Cleve Sims in the middle of the 19th century. He actually wrote to Congress. He got as many as 25 congressmen to vote in favor of sponsoring an expedition to both the North and the South Pole to dig a hole of several miles perimeter that would connect the two poles. I promise you something crazy. Here is the monument in Ohio to the Sims theory of concentric spheres. He wrote a book in which he suggested that the hole at the North Pole and the South Pole connected would test his theory. He wanted to go and find the hole all the way through the Earth and prove that the Earth is actually made up of concentric spheres. Even today, there is proponents of the hollow Earth theory. And so I think the point that I'm going to make heavy-handedly here is that when we talk about geopolitics, we have to be very careful what kind of Earth, what kind of planet it is that we ask our decision makers to imagine. The North and South Pole regions are also the last remaining territory in the globe that most of us have never visited firsthand. They're becoming tourist attractions for extreme tourism, but mostly they're the territory of science, of high-tech science. And throughout the 19th and 20th century and into the 21st, attempts to lay claim to the last remaining territory on the globe become legible as grasping for the primary, the untouched or unmarked original emptiness, tracing the outlines of the unknown, illuminating the previously unexposed. This cartography of areas without any traces of human life and history seeks to shed light on the differences and connections between the Arctic and the Antarctic. Antarctic, of course, ghosted through the history of thinking mostly as speculation. People said it ought to be there, but nobody could prove that it is. It is in this sense that Amundsen manages to invert a cliché about science fiction. All his life, he had been a man of the North. But when Cook and Peary claimed the North Pole, this cast his desire in a different light. He just switched polarity, not a hunger for place, but for position, a concentration on time rather than space, a desire to write one's name on history rather than to occupy a place on Earth. There's this invisible axis that seems to promise going off-world. One trajectory of what one ought to be able to excavate as the historical logic for geophilosophy of polar media indicates a shift in the 19th century from a pronounced emphasis on race to a growing concern with environmental factors, with weather, and with the global meteorological consequences of melting ice caps in the course of the 20th and 21st century. Indeed, one might claim that the complex racial tensions that used to be found in nearly every canonical text through the 19th century more recently yield to climate consciousness and global politics. That, of course, raises the question whether we have simply overcome racial difficulties or whether we're now covering them over. Antarctica figured as a southern counterpart to the Ultima Thule of occult and racist fantasies about the North, where the imaginary line that would be the Earth's axis exits or enters. And that's where John Cleves Sims posited a hole, or rather a tunnel. I quote, "I declare the Earth is hollow and habitable within," he wrote, arguing of the entire globe that it is open at the poles. This theory is astonishingly popular. There's at least one extant monument here to the theory in Hamilton, Ohio. Its inscriptions, however, are defaced almost to the point of illegibility. It's about 5 feet high. It shows that hollow sphere carried by a four-sided shaft. It was to illustrate what Sims had proposed in his circular that he sent out over decades to many institutions in the United States and Europe, asking for the patronage of, among others, Alexander von Humboldt. He proposed an expedition of, quote, 100 brave companions well equipped to start from Siberia in the fall season with reindeer and sledges on the ice of the frozen sea. I engage we find a warm and rich land stocked with thrifty vegetables and animals, if not men, on reaching 1 degree northward of latitude 82. We will return in the succeeding spring, end quote. So this idea of finding Simsonia, the land of perfect whiteness and an abode of race perfect in its kind, quote, was held out in Harper's Magazine to be a great motivation also for Antarctic exploration. All the way into the 20th century, people kept pursuing this idea. Charles Whiting Beale's The Secret of the Earth has two brothers fly through the hollow Earth on her homemade airship. They enter through the North Pole and exit from the South Pole. James Fenimore Cooper's The Monarchins have a British aristocrat who learns that when the Earth exploded at the pole, the result was an open sea and a steamy climate. And Jules Verne's imagination situates an active volcano on the poles as yet unmapped space around them, driving the polar explorer Hatteras mad with frustration at being unable to set foot on the exact spot. Jules Verne's balloons, sea and airships, train, and automobiles are properly speaking devices that enable temporal and psychic transformation of his characters in parallel with their spatial movements. As late as 1873, the Atlantic Monthly could still argue the feasibility of Sims' theory. Only the Amundsen and Scott expeditions would finally lay it to rest. Nonetheless, even Rudy Rucker's book, The Hollow Earth, still tells of the narrative of Mason Algers Reynolds of Virginia, and of course patterns on Edgar Allan Poe, where Edgar Allan Poe and companions fall into the hollow Earth after the South Polar regions collapse. This is written and published in 1990. And Edgar Allan Poe, in fact, was greatly fascinated with the hollow Earth's idea of Sims, and may have projected onto this global fantasy the tensions between North and South in the United States. Furthermore, Poe ends the travel narrative of Pym with a fictive editor's framing note that associates the whiteout of South Pole with the black cavern of the inverted Eden he calls Tsalal, along with speculations on the black-on-white scribbles that he hints denote shade and darkness in esoteric languages. There's Gulliver's Travel with similar fare. There's Frankenstein, where the hubris of creating life meets its double in Walton's desire to, quote, satiate my curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited. And as Shelley wrote, what may not be expected in a country of eternal light? I may there discover the wondrous power which extracts the needle and may regulate 1,000 celestial observations that require only this voyage to render the seemic eccentricities consistent forever. Yet viewers of James Whale's classic horror films based on Frankenstein realize that this landscape is by the same token one of eternal darkness, where proximity to one source of magnetism occludes the opposite balancing pole. And as an aside, there's a lost short comic silent film that is set at a location with a sign that says North Pole 3 miles to the south. Even Pynchon invokes the hollow earth theory with the fantasy of, quote, our barbaric and unknown race employed by God knows whom are even now blasting the Antarctic ice with dynamite, preparing to enter a subterranean network of natural tunnels, a network whose existence is known only to the inhabitants and to the Royal Geographic Society in London and the spies in Florence. This is from V. The point I want to get to is that polar media, these representations of the North and South Pole, or fantasies about the North and South Pole regions, are literally and metaphorically about exposure. The dual claims to discovery of the North Pole by Cook and Peary are each cast in doubt due to the shadows they cast in their North Pole photographs, which gave away that they were in fact not taken at latitude 90. Owing to this ironic luck of history, or bad luck of history, each subsequent exploration remains possible, since no unique discovery had once and for all disclosed and documented the pure retreat that is the pole. And of course, the magnetic pole actually shifts location, so you can rediscover it each time. This idea of an untouched, unseen, unexposed purity of the globe that is somehow forever held in reserve must be preserved and protected from the expeditions that are nonetheless motivated by it, and thus polar media exhibit the structure of permanent deferral that is both dear to the scientific mind and to the storyteller. Any renewed claim to the North Pole, for instance the one staked by Russia recently after a submarine crossing, makes news. I quote, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explained the flag painting with a precedent vividly etched in the modern imagination. Whenever explorers reach some point that no one else has explored, they plant a flag, he said. That's how it was on the moon, by the way. And indeed, often the polar regions stand in for the moon or even the Mars, and vice versa. Here we recognize what polar expeditions share with climbing to the summits of the highest mountains. The whole point of going is to return home with bragging rights. Unlike science fiction about visits to or from another planet, achieving true north or true south is merely the arrival at an abstract location, a singular point undifferentiated from its surroundings. This is seen in Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, and Kurt Laswit's On Two Planets, in Kim Stanley Robinson's science fiction novels, and in many other fare that uses the stories of Amundsen and Scott. So when I talk about polar media, I don't actually lay claim to any discovery. The titular claim would just be to situate representations of the Arctic and Antarctic as a topic in media history. To this day, the attraction of the North and South Pole remains one of heroic detection. Certainly they have been discovered, certainly they've inspired myth, literature, science, and art, but nonetheless the polar regions remain inaccessible, unrepresentable, devoid of contrast, there to be found and rediscovered. This is especially true for the kind of art history that hews to the patterns of the detective novel, reconstructing from traces a grammar of object and authorship. But it applies equally to film and media art in the age of ecotourism, where discovery remains the motive, following snow-blown trails into nothingness, even and especially after the preceding discoveries had imprinted the landscape with their names and deaths. How else would we explain the recent cinematic resurgence of the polar regions, from children's fare like The Golden Compass to art house cinema like Werner Herzog's Antarctic Paean Encounters at the End of the World. There are many other examples that I'll have in slides in a moment. Outlining research trajectories on polar media recovers traces from oblivion, but like most armchair adventures, it often only amounts to the act of exposing your pen to the frozen history of polar media to retrieve nothing more or less than a few stories to be retold. Design history gives pride of place to Buckminster Fuller, and he in turn, in his The Maximum Projection Map of the Planet, gives pride of place to the polar regions. There are, of course, many different versions of this. Some of you might secretly or not so secretly even have laminated versions at home or in your offices. An image like this reminds us of the contrast we tend to make between surface and interiority, and by extension between a superficial and a deep understanding of the issues facing our planet. By the same token, though, the kind of systematic approach that Buckminster Fuller had advocated in writing about Earth and designing an Earth that can sustain the population was attacked immediately by his contemporaries as technocratic and problematic and so on and so forth. But it stays with us as one of the few attempts to actually focus the eye on both surface and depth in a different way, in a way that, of course, geographers have since then been problematizing in multiply productive ways. Recent fiction tries to account for the fascination the polar regions still exert on the popular imagination. And I think if we're going to be motivating each other in our different disciplines with a planetary consciousness or a geophilosophical awareness, we could do worse than reading these new utopian or dystopian or even apocalyptic novels, whether it's Kim Stanley Robinson or going back all the way to 1605 when Bishop Joseph Hall, under the name of Mercurio Britannico, wrote speculatively about going to Antarctica and discovering a land where you can circle a day in a year or a year in a day. There, of course, are also counterexamples of Kim Stanley Robinson, a local hero who did his English PhD here in San Diego before going into fiction. There's Michael Crichton's State of Fear, a very successful thriller denying global warming and vilifying ecological activism. Just like Kim Stanley Robinson's Antarctica, it's a book about the high-tech environmental liberation front type organization in Antarctica. There are curiosities in science fiction, like the book from 1954, Tom Swift and his Atomic Earth Blaster, where the protagonist leads an expedition to the South Pole to mine iron at the center of the Earth. Or Ian Banks' The Business, a thriller about the only non-governmental organization, NGO, that owns a base in Antarctica. There are many other polar eco-thrillers that stage environmentalists battling industrial mining prospectors on the Antarctic Ross Ice Shelf. But I promised Ben that I would do my worst, so I'm going to go right to the bottom of this apparently endless hole that I'm falling into, namely the form of thinking that we know as conspiracy theory. A secret land, I finally got a hand on A Secret Land, which is the first non-war related documentary to win an Oscar. It's a film made about Operation High Jump, a large-scale expedition to Antarctica, led by various experienced military personnel under Admiral Byrd. And I was going to play some shaky clips, but luckily or unfortunately, my computer crashed just before lunch, so I'm not going to do that again. I'm just going to show you some stills so that we can all end our day rather sooner than later. Secret Land, starring men and ships of the U.S. Navy, photographed by the Navy and Marine Corps and Coast Guard and Army, narrated by men in uniform. And unfortunately, the admiral came back in ill health, including maybe mental ill health, and made some unguarded comments that have almost immediately given rise to all sorts of hollow earth ideas that he may have gone there in 1945 to battle those Nazis that didn't actually lose but retreated to Neuschwabenland with their flying UFOs and had those thrifty vegetables and healthy animals in a dry valley. There are, of course, dry valleys in Antarctica, but please. But where does conspiracy go? You know, where does conspiracy live? On the internet. That's where I live too. So it's my friendly neighbor, and I'll indulge in a little bit of this kind of theory. It's not so crazy because you can read in Pythias and Pliny that travel in the margins of the known world and being carried off into the unknown by 9 days for 9 days by a storm can happen to the ancient seafarer. And their descriptions of nights becoming shorter in the high north are hardly fantasy or speculation. The Western canon is replete with intertextual and metapoetical references from Homer to Petrarch, from the Book of Job to Dante's Inferno, from Coleridge's Ancient Mariner to Poe's Pym, and from Moby Dick to T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. While traveling on ice, Frankenstein's monster reads Milton's Paradise Lost, which also provides a motto to Shelley's book. Borges rewrote The Last Trip of Ulysses. Jules Verne refictionalized Poe's frame narrative around Arthur Gordon Pym, and Nabokov dramatized the last days of Robert F. Scott's failed expedition in his verse play, The Pole. Pynchon has his protagonist Godolphin tell about his lonely journey to the South Pole in winter 1898. I quote, "Only by the merest happenstance did he escape the private logic of that ice world." And even more recent serious fiction like Stendhal-Daldy's Discovery of Slowness or Ransmayer's Terrors of Ice and Darkness also manages to juxtapose the diaries of memoirs of real polar explorers with their own metafictional narratives about being captivated and captured by a special secret world, a secret land. And I already got, in the last 2 days, from chatting with people here at the conference, several more recommendations for things like that to read. So Antarctica figures prominently in what's probably the most crazy and most recognizable kind of X-Files type conspiracy theory. One of my favorite examples that I called from the web actually belongs properly on the web. It was started there. It's one of the better webcomics, The Chronicles of William Bazillion. And there's a great episode about the hunt for Günter Klaus, who is known to you as Santa Claus, who enslaved a race of elves and amassed riches sufficient to support Christmas presents to all humans once a year. And how do you pursue Günter Klaus, or alias Santa Claus, through the Arctic and Antarctic regions? Well, it's very simple. You go to Svalbard. Anybody here from the NOAA or NASA? No? Well, what do you find in Svalbard? You find the global seed vault, another emblem, another image that holds great promise for planetary consciousness, for geopolitical consciousness. It's not just another big hole in the ground, and that it is. It is, of course, the promise that biodiversity might be protected even against catastrophic climate change. There are other big science installations on Svalbard, which are several flight hours north of Norway, in the high Arctic, including, as you see here, the Svalbard Mars analog expedition, Arctic Mars analog. It's clear, though, that compartmentalizing science and fiction in a way, that tends to trivialize one or the other, or maybe both, has its own risks. They can cross-fertilize to a certain amount, to a certain extent, and then it becomes problematic. Nonetheless, when big science wants to fire the imagination towards the planetary consciousness, when we want to translate lessons learned about the climate or about any other large system into images that take hold, we must remember that just as Sims, who was a respected veteran and writer, not a crazy person, lobbied Congress, it also took Stuart Brand several years to lobby for an image of the Earth as a whole. When you go from Jules Verne's cartography, this is a North Pole area where he makes himself a character, a cartographer for the story that drives Hatteras crazy. It's not that striking an image. Of course, his kinds of stories have been translated into much more visual narratives, including computer games. Computer games like 20,000 Leagues, The Adventure Continues. These, of course, have a very simple and endearing kind of precursor history. Penguin Adventure, did anybody play Penguin Adventure? Also called Antarctic Adventure. Just like Alice, this penguin can accelerate to amazing speed. And it avoids seals or collides with seals. The more serious games that try to implement, like this Super Antarctic Challenge, try to implement ways in which you could improve the situation, or games that illustrate global warming concepts, such as Ice Core Quest. But ultimately, even as powerful an artist as Werner Herzog is in Encounters at the End of the Earth, and even as popular as many other films have been, from The Thing or Nanook of the North, which is another very early example of the genre, to Scott of the Antarctic, or Hell Below Zero, or Absolute Zero, or March of the Penguins, or Happy Feet, or 8 Below. Aren't you glad I didn't play clips? 8 Below, or of course the X-Files. Ultimately, there's a scissoring effect here. There's a problem. You can turn a very good PowerPoint slideshow into an award-winning movie. But as powerful as some of Al Gore's images were, they don't quite live up to this. This is by far the most commonly recognized, the most widely distributed, and the most often reproduced image ever. Planet Earth, taken by the astronauts of Apollo 17 on December 7th, 1972. And I quote from one of them, "When you get 250,000 miles from Earth and look back, the Earth is really beautiful. You can see the roundness. You can see from the snow cap of the North Pole to the ice caps of the South Pole. You can see across continents. You look for the strings that are holding this Earth up, and you look for the fulcrum, and it doesn't exist." Now, in the original photo, the South Polar ice cap appears on top, and the North was at the bottom of the photo because of the orientation in which the astronauts were traveling. And as I said, Stuart Brand had been lobbying NASA since 1966, 6 years, to release a photo that would show the entire Earth. And of course, when they didn't release it, they had to turn it upside down so that the blue marble would not emphasize Antarctica too much. And by the way, the 1995 film Apollo 13, that was directed by Ron Howard, still shows that same Apollo 17 photograph of Earth countless times. But every time Tom Hanks looks out the window, he sees Antarctica. So evidently the planet does not rotate in Hollywood. It might rotate around Hollywood, but in such a way it has to always show Antarctica. I've only shown you a little sample of all of the Antarctica movies that we have. And I'm hoping that eventually they'll reach a critical mass that makes us pay attention to what these are really about. Of course, Chernin, who I just quoted about the Earth, is the last person to walk on the moon. And when he says, you see from pole to pole and across oceans and continents, you can watch it turn and there's no strings holding it up and it's moving in blackness that's almost beyond conception. That's a powerful way of initiating geo-imaginary, geopolitical, planetary consciousness. There are other artists, other ways to do this. Andrea Pawley deserves to be mentioned for her sound art installation. There's a measuring system in the ice of the North Pole that's projected onto a circle and accompanied by a synthetic bass sound that slowly increases and decreases in volume. Cracks appear in the ice, water gushes out, puddles are formed. The measuring system that the NOAA gave her access to can go haywire, can go threaten to sink in the water like a foundering ship. The ice can then be seen again, a measuring system, a rod. The sound can swell to unbearable level. Strong gusts of wind cause the rod to land in the puddles of water, etc. There's a 45-minute audio-visual installation that points to a polar juxtaposition of extreme nature and high technology. Now, more recently, there's, of course, DJ Spooky, who's not only remixed Sinfonia Antarctica, which was written for score marking the anniversary, no, I have to read. He remixes a symphony that was written for the 50th anniversary of a symphony that was written as a score for a New Zealand expedition to Antarctica. So there's multiple levels of mashup going on. You can find these in clips on his site. He's come out with a book of ice. He's announced other artworks that will come to art galleries near you soon. I'm going to wrap up by pointing out that not only should we not forget about this shift from racial tension to temperature measurements or CO2 measurements or any number of other concerns. Also, why did we even get to the phase of heroic exploration of the North and South Pole? It was a redeployment of military personnel in the 19th century, of naval personnel. At the turn of the 21st century, the redeployment that directs our attentions to the North and South Pole areas is not one of military personnel, but one of industrial resources, whereby the very remoteness, the lasting darkness of Arctic and Antarctic is pictured, broadcast, webcast, whereby former Soviet icebreakers that threatened to become unsupportable on dwindling budgets are turned over to private enterprise as lucrative tourist vessels venturing into extreme regions. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences asserts that, quote, polar regions play key roles in understanding impacts of ever-changing space weather on technologies for modern communication and power distribution. This, of course, goes back decades. Howard Hughes' obsession with the Cold War thriller ice station Zebra looms large here, 1968, by John Sturges, based on Alistair MacLean's novel of the same title. It revolves, of course, around satellite espionage. I quote, the Russians put our camera made by our German scientists and your film made by your German scientists into their satellite made by their German scientists, end quote. You just can't get rid of those occult Nazis everywhere. Indeed, the U.S. Department of Defense objections to Paddy Chayefsky's screenplay in the early 60s delayed the start of production on Ice Station Zebra for several years. I already told you about The Secret Land from 1948, the documentary on the secretive Operation High Jump, led by Admiral Byrd. I'm going to end by switching poles once more, because no cursory appreciation of the popular imaginary of polar media, crazy or not, as they're incorporated in all of these fictional accounts, can go without parsing what is carried in films like The Thing from Another World, 1951, and its remake, The Thing, from 1982. Like adventure tourism to the North and South Poles, they illustrate what Robinson's novel, Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, denotes as the purest forms of escapism. I quote, most people who came to Antarctica to do something hard came precisely because it's so much easier than staying at home and facing whatever they had to face there. Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World exposes scientists and soldiers to a destructive magnetic field after a recent meteor fell into the Arctic near an American early warning installation. At the site of the impact, they discover a flying saucer, which is destroyed in the attempt to recover it. but they managed to thaw out the alien pilot, and although some scientists initially argue for the preservation of alien life, the military eventually manages to destroy the thing after it goes on a rampage. As with most Cold War horror, the implied moral is simplistic and xenophobic. 3 decades later, John Carpenter's The Thing, the remake, switches polarity not only by transferring the setting from the dew line near the North Pole to the Antarctic, but also by having only the thing survive, substituting despair and paranoia for the jingoistic stance of the McCarthy era. And only a few years later, after John Carpenter's film, the Antarctic ice, in fact, did release the body of 3 members of an 1845 polar expedition led by Sir John Franklin. Coming after the Korean and Vietnam War experiences, the Carpenter film illustrates the impossibility of victory by exploiting a collective fear of the beast within man, marking the Antarctic as a profoundly alien space. Here the thing is a shapeshifter, first encountering the scientist investigating the fate of their Norwegian colleagues as a dog. We may do well to remember this twist on the companion animal and emergency protein source for Polar Explorer, a chilly twist on how science maintains a tenuous hold on the inhospitable terrain. For while the dew line was eventually replaced by satellites, there are at least 28 nations that maintain a regular human presence in the Antarctic, and dog patrols or dog sled expeditions are the norm around the Arctic Circle, wherever politics and science are in play. So maybe instead of the trope of an expanding, accelerating grasp of the globe in a near-future utopia, planetary consciousness has to take its roots in cartography, systematization, and the evolution of technical media, without forgetting the colonial and imperial past. After World War II, planetarism played a pivotal role in the founding of the United Nations, culminating in the 1980 McBride report to UNESCO that was recommending mass communication access for all, from paper to geostationary orbits. Marshall McLuhan, by the way, was appointed to that commission, but was too ill to participate. The US, of course, withdrew in protest against that report from UNESCO and only rejoined decades later in 2003. Similarly, the protest from many against the 1972 report on the limits of growth by the Club of Rome shows that the planetary imaginary requires more than just scenarios, PowerPoint slides, and graphs of think tanks. Geopolitics must harness world images, media governance, and techniques of visibility in ways that get us unstuck from all of the Nazi occultism and the trauma of world wars. Thank you.